apologize for being late, but we had votes, and they took longer than anybody expected. But I want to thank our witnesses for taking the time to share their expertise and their experiences with us today. Transnational repression is when human rights violations cross borders. It can be done through killings, abductions, or enforced disappearances. The murder of Roberto Samcam, a retired Nicaraguan army officer living in Costa Rica, who was critical of the Ortega government, may be such a case. Or it could come by online harassment, digital surveillance, and targeting of relatives, creating a chilling effect on the rights of freedom of expression and association. Our last hearing on this topic was only a year and a half ago. We are revisiting the issue because it is growing in relevance and interest among policymakers, and there are new multilateral developments to assess. Today we have a witness from Freedom House, which maintains a database of transnational repression, which now contains 1,219 incidents across 103 countries. Many, many more incidences go unreported. It is not just the number of cases that is increasing. We are learning of new and devious ways that governments are reaching across borders to infringe on people's rights. Today, we will hear from the president of the Open Dialogue Foundation. She and her organization have been the target of transnational repression through the international financial system and the weaponization of laws designed to deal with money laundering, financing of terrorism, cybersecurity, and mutual legal assistance. Beyond the themes and trends, we must remember that acts of transnational repression affect the lives of individuals. Today, we will hear from two witnesses who will speak of their own personal experiences and those of their friends and families of being targeted by the governments of Pakistan and Hong Kong for exercising their freedoms of expression and of press. And we will get an update on the experiences among the Indian diaspora in the wake of the targeting of members of the Sikh community, including the June 2023 killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada, and the plot to kill Gurpatwant Pahan, a U.S.-based immigration lawyer and Sikh activist. Sadly, there are many, many more stories to tell. This hearing has attracted a lot of interest. We could fill many witness tables today. And without objection, I move to submit for the record additional relevant statements that we receive. To tackle the challenges of transnational repression, we need a common definition, an awareness of the many ways it manifests, and an understanding of how acts of TNR represent violations of human rights. Just last week, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a fact sheet listing prevalent forms of transnational repression and common effects on persons targeted. Importantly, it notes that non-state actors such as private companies and technology firms, criminal networks, private militia or paramilitary groups, and media organizations can also play a role in transnational repression at the request or with the acquiescence of the repressing state. OHCHR affirms that it remains the obligation of all states must respect and protect human rights and refrain from committing, enabling, or condoning acts of transnational repression. Therefore, it was welcome to see the statement on TNR made at the G7 summit last week in Canada. It outlines an agenda for action, including a plan to develop a TNR resilience and response framework and launch a digital TNR detection academy. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses how the United States government can support and build on this important multilateral effort. We in Congress are trying to do our part. In the last Congress, Co-Chair Smith and I introduced the Transnational Repression Policy Act to require an interagency strategy to address TNR at home and abroad. I'm pleased to report that we are working with Senator Jeff Merkley, with whom we have both served as co-chair on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, to update the legislation for reintroduction. I welcome any input from our witnesses on the content of that legislation. Domestically, law enforcement agencies are paying attention to this problem. Federal prosecutors have brought criminal charges for acts that fall within the definition of transnational repression. The FBI has improved its intake system for reporting on cases and maintains a transnational repression information page. However, there is a need for enhanced coordination between federal and local law enforcement to identify, prevent, and respond to TNR. As a case study, last year, Students for a Free Tibet and the Hong Kong Democracy Council released a report entitled Exporting Repression, assessing the inadequacy of the local police response to Chinese government-instigated attacks on peaceful protesters at the APEC Summit in San Francisco on November 2023. As with all human rights issues, the United States is best positioned to make a positive difference if it leads by example. We lose credibility to speak from a place of moral authority if our own government engages in behavior that it criticizes others for. I am concerned when I read that the State Department is requiring foreign students applying for a visa to set their social media profiles to public in order to allow U.S. officials to judge if their opinions meet some arbitrary and potentially politically motivated standard. The effect of this policy would be to require students in other countries to restrict their speech in order to be eligible for entry into the United States. That would be a cross-border restriction on freedom of expression. In other words, transnational repression. We will hear testimony today about how China punishes people in the United States for speech that their government doesn't like. We should not be in the business of doing the same by penalizing people in other countries for speech that our government doesn't like. Transnational repression is a human rights issue. We must center our approach on the victims of these harmful acts. We must listen to them and commit to protecting them so they are free from the efforts of governments beyond our borders to deny their basic human rights. And with that, I will now introduce our witnesses. Here we go.
There's a vote on a motion to adjourn.
Okay, so I just was told that there is a vote on the motion to adjourn. This is the day that is not going well, but how much time we have left on the vote?
13 minutes.
Okay, well, let me introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to rush over and vote and run right back, and then we get into the testimony. So Yana Gorovskovskaya, did I say that correctly? Is the research director for strategy and design at Freedom House, where she leads the organization's work on transnational repression and has authored several reports on the targeting of exiled journalists and international students. Previously, she was a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia University. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia in her home country of Canada. Ludmila Lavska, right? I'm from Massachusetts. I have tough time pronouncing anything. She's the president of the Open Dialogue Foundation. ODF has advocated for political prisoners across the post-Soviet region and for G7 sanctions against Russia in response to its aggression in Ukraine. Because of this work, she and her organization have faced hostility from the government of Russia and others, and previously Poland and Moldova. She has pushed reform of Interpol due to its misuse as a tool of political prosecution. Ahmad Noorani is an investigative journalist and editor of Fact Focus. He's a graduate of Columbia University School of Journalism and holds a master's degree in political science from Pakistan. He has reported on corruption and misconduct by military officials. He's founded Fact Focus, a digital platform dedicated to investigative journalism, after he was dismissed from his job following pressure from the Pakistani army. Ria Chakrabarti is the senior policy director at Hindus for Human Rights, where she conducts advocacy with governments and the United Nations. She leads her organization's human rights campaign in support of Indian democracy, the release of political prisoners, and minority rights in South Asia. She has also worked with the U.S. Senate and the World Health Organization. Joey Su is a human rights advocate and spokesperson of Amnesty International Hong Kong overseas. As a student leader, she helped organize the 2019 pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. She also serves as the executive on the Executive Council of the World Liberty Congress. In December 2023, the Hong Kong authorities issued a bounty of $1 million Hong Kong dollars against her due to her activism in exile. And did I pronounce your last name? Okay, good, all right. Paulo Figueiredo, okay, all right, I'm getting better. Grandson of former Brazilian President João Figueiredo, is a journalist. He holds a specialization in entrepreneurship and innovation from Harvard Business School, certifications in business, international relations, and political economy from the London School of Economics, and microeconomics courses from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He appears on a wide range of television programs and podcasts and internet channels. And I'm just going to temporarily suspend, go run and vote, and you can time me. All right, back. So we'll begin with Ms. Goroka Skyva to begin. And again, I apologize. This has just been a crazy day, so the floor is yours.
Wonderful, thank you. Congressman McGovern, members of the Commission, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Freedom House greatly appreciates your leadership on this issue. As Congressman McGovern already mentioned, transnational repression is a set of physical and digital tactics used by governments to reach across borders in order to silence dissidents and members of their diaspora. It threatens not only the targeted individual and the community, but also the functioning of democratic institutions and indeed national security. Since Freedom House presented in front of this commission in February of last year, we have added another 160 physical incidents of transnational repression to our database. That database, which spans 2014 to 2024, now contains 1,219 incidents across 103 countries. As Congressman McGovern already mentioned, this really only represents the tip of the iceberg because we're recording verified physical incidents. I want to describe three striking findings from our data. First, the desire among governments to silence dissent beyond their borders is unfortunately widespread. 48 governments, and that's nearly a quarter of the world's states, have used tactics of transnational repression in the last 10 years. At least 19 have used spyware against targets in exile. Second, although the governments of Russia, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Uzbekistan, Rwanda, and Cambodia aggressively pursue dissidents abroad, the Chinese government remains the most prolific perpetrator of transnational repression, undertaking the world's most sophisticated and comprehensive campaign. Third, transnational repression is made possible by cooperation between states. In 2/3 of the incidents that we have recorded, authorities in countries where the dissidents have resettled have collaborated with perpetrator states to facilitate transnational repression through mechanisms like Interpol notices, extradition, and unlawful deportation. In addition to tracking trends and incidents, Freedom House also examines policy responses of host states, and in fact, we just published a report on Canada about which I'll say a few words. In Canada, growing attention over the last 3 years to the issue of transnational repression has been motivated by two factors. The first is fears around foreign interference that were driven by findings that the government of China targeted Canadian politicians critical of Beijing during national elections with smear campaigns and threats against their extended families. Although there has not been any definitive proof that these efforts impacted the election outcomes, the Canadian government has undertaken changes in policy and practice that are intended to protect the country's political institutions. Second, many Canadians became concerned about the menace of extraterritorial violence in 2023 after the Canadian government announced that it believed that agents of the Indian government were credibly linked to the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Sikh activist and naturalized Canadian citizen. Public demands for responses resulted in a number of government reports, a public inquiry, and changes to legislation, including the adoption of criminal penalties for harassment, intimidation, and other acts done on behalf of a foreign entity. The Canadian government also provided significant leadership in shepherding a leader's statement on transnational repression that just came out of the G7 summit. I'd be happy to answer questions about any of these responses, but I want to conclude my testimony by highlighting one strategy of the Canadian government that we at Freedom House think is especially helpful in addressing transnational repression, and that is direct community engagement. In early 2025, agencies of the Canadian government began holding community meetings with diasporas across Canadian cities. These meetings provided information about newly adopted legislation as well as tactics of and ways to report transnational repression. Importantly, these meetings included police from local jurisdictions. Meetings like these help mitigate the threat posed by foreign governments by bringing diasporas closer to the agencies and institutions of their host government, and that includes police forces. Ultimately, these are the kinds of connections that help build resilience. Autocrats around the world are hoping that democratic governments will not protect exiles and diasporas in the exercise of their fundamental freedoms. We must prove them wrong. Alongside community engagement of the type that the Canadian government is doing, Freedom House also recommends that governments, 1, adopt an official government-wide definition of transnational repression that can be used across departments and in official communication. 2, provide training for federal, state, and local law enforcement on tactics of transnational repression. And 3, raise transnational repression as a priority issue with partner governments at international fora, while also pursuing accountability for perpetrator governments through sanctions, visa restrictions, export controls over technology used for transnational repression, like commercial spyware. Again, thank you very much for your leadership, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kozlowska.
Chairman McGovern, thank you so much. I appreciate really the opportunity to address one of the most urgent and sophisticated way of transnational repression, weaponization of financial and cybersecurity regulation by authoritarian regimes, along with mutual legal assistance agreements. It poses a critical threat to national security, rule of law, human rights in the US and beyond. Open Dialogue Foundation experience itself and collected evidences how authoritarian regimes and their proxies are now systematically weaponizing important regulatory recommendations developed by the Financial Action Task Force. Many authoritarian regimes have used such tactics to target our organization. For example, dissemination of false information against us, fabricating criminal cases, or using strategical litigations against us to undermine our economic reputation. As a result, our bank accounts, crypto asset services provider accounts, crowdfunding platform accounts were terminated. Our financial data was weaponized, both against donors, recipients of the funds, our partners, and our family members transnationally. This is what we call transnational financial repression. How was it possible? Authoritarian regimes abused AML compliance frameworks created by Financial Action Task Force. This led banks, crypto asset services providers, crowdfunding platforms to categorize Open Dialogue Foundation and its associates as high-risk clients, resulting in closures of our accounts in Western jurisdictions. All of this despite repeated court victories proving the accusations were unfounded. Under this regulatory pressure, Open Dialogue Foundation increasingly turned into Bitcoin peer-to-peer payment tools to overcome transnational financial repression, to continue our human rights work, and to deliver humanitarian aid, including Ukraine, since Russian full invasion since February 2022, especially when all traditional financial institutions were paralyzed. So how does transnational financial repression spread to the United States? I will illustrate it with 2 examples. First, the case of Barlik Mendagaziv and his family members who are US citizens and have their businesses and charity in Charlotte. Their case demonstrates the threat to US residents and entities faced from transnational financial repression. Their persecution stems from 2 factors. First, their success as American investor in Kazakhstan who refused to pay briberies to the corrupt regime. And secondly, their US-based charity supported families of political prisoners in Kazakhstan. They now face continuous pressure and risk of having their bank accounts terminated by the US financial institutions following the actions of Kazakhstani regime. Barlik's case, along with his brother's Bekizhan imprisonment as a political hostage in Kazakhstan, exemplified transnational repression that has been officially documented in the 3 US State Department human rights report between 2021 and 2023. However, there are no effective regulatory remedies to prevent this kind of persecution or defend US residents, entities, or especially philanthropists supporting pro-democracy movement from these kind of attacks. Another example, the group of Kazakhstani Secret Services operatives filed a coordinated legal complaint based on Wagyu, cybersecurity, and AML regulation accusations in Belgium against me and Open Dialogue Foundation, pressuring us to remove testimonies of victims of mass shooting and torture in Kazakhstan. These operatives, while posing as a private citizen acting on behalf of their minor children, demanded full access to my personal and organization financial records, communication, and travel data, both in United States and in European Union. Luckily, because of the previous transnational repression, Belgium provided me protection, And Belgian police and judges, investigative judges, explicitly refused to share my data and help us to document this case. I stop here, and I'm very grateful for your leadership in this issue. I'm looking forward for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Noorani.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to appear before you. I am Ahmed Noorani. I have been an investigative journalist in Pakistan's capital Islamabad for almost 15 years, where I mostly reported about poor governance and corruption in public sector. I am living in exile in the United States for the last 5 years. In Pakistan, the army is all powerful, and criticizing or writing about military is almost impossible. I face serious problems and attacks, and my family was subjected to harassment throughout my career. Committee to Protect Journalists has documented many of these instances during the last 2 decades. One of the most serious attacks occurred in October 2017 when I was attacked in front of the headquarters of intelligence agency ISI, and my head was struck with iron rod and I was almost killed. But luckily I survived. Once I recovered, I resumed my work. In February 2019, after a job of 13 years, I was sacked. I was fired by my employer under the pressure of military. The allegation was that I used the photo of Jamal Khashoggi as my Twitter profile during the state visit of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to Pakistan. I was accepted into Scholars at Risk program at Missouri School of Journalism in 2020, where I launched a digital media platform, Fact Focus, using which I started reporting about the corruption of Pakistan Army journals. In 2022, I reported about the wealth accumulated by the family of the then Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa. As a result, many cases were registered against me, and my family home was raided. However, no one was arrested at that time. Simply few weeks before, in March 2025, I reported about the wrongdoings and nepotism of the current Army Chief, General Asim Munir, based on credible evidence and verified facts. Shortly after this publication, I became the target of severe transnational repression orchestrated by Pakistan Army. In retaliation for my reporting, my innocent family members in Pakistan were abducted, brutally tortured, and held in illegal custody, part of a ruthless campaign of silence to silence my voice and punish those connected to me. They were released after 33 days. After their release, Pakistan Army blocked bank accounts of all my family members, including the pension account of my 66-year-old mother, leaving them unable to meet even basic daily needs. They are living in the same condition even today. While the Fact Focus is already blocked in Pakistan, a few days before, Pakistan Army has even blocked my YouTube channel, which is currently the major source of my income. This is not justice. This is state terrorism. On November 26, 2024, Pakistan Army opened fire on peaceful protesters in front of the Parliament House in Islamabad, killing and injuring dozens of innocent citizens. What rules Pakistan today is not government. It is a criminal cartel in uniform, a mafia wrapped in flag, operating with total impunity under the illusion of national security. Let me be direct. These are war crimes. These are crimes against humanity. What kind of government assassinate its journalists abroad? What kind of regime torture critics and intimidate families on American soil? The murder of journalist Arshad Sharif in Kenya in 2022 was not a tragic error. It was a cross-border assassination coordinated with the foreign operatives to silence a voice that exposed Pakistan Army's corruption. Another prominent journalist, Dr. Moeed Pirzada, now in exile in the United States, has been labeled as a terrorist by the Pakistani state. His family properties have been seized, his relatives harassed, his voice attacked because he speaks truth. And I say this with utmost seriousness. What Pakistan's military and intelligence networks are doing on the American soil through digital surveillance, threatening calls, blackmail, intimidation of family members, and online harassment constitutes an attack on the US sovereignty. These are not just diplomatic issues. These are the federal crimes. They violate the Civil Rights Act, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FORA, the very principle of political asylum and the safety that the United States promises to those fleeing tyranny. We are witnessing transnational repression in its most aggressive form, carried out by the journals wearing medals stained with the blood of their own people. And today, the machinery of repression is being led by General Asim Munir, the current Chief of the Army Staff. Under his command, the military has intensified the crackdown on dissent, criminalized journalism, and extended policy of abduction, activists, torturing citizens, and rigging elections. Mass trials of the military courts to threatening against exiles living in the West, Asim Munir has accelerated every tool of tyranny. His hands are no more cleaner than his predecessors. They may be bloodier. Let me remind this commission. Many politicians, including the chief of the biggest political party of the country, are rotting in solitary confinement on the fabricated charges. Thousands of peaceful protesters, citizens remain jailed without due process. The Constitution has been gutted, replaced by the martial law in all but name. Judges are coerced, blackmailed, and silenced. Election Commission is completely under military control, and it facilitated the army in rigging February 24 elections. Media is crushed. Journalists have to self-censor or have to face what I am facing or my family faced. X, formerly Twitter, was banned for more than a year. This is not democracy. It is military dictatorship cloaked in civilian clothes, run by the war criminals, mafias, and intelligence operatives who fear only one thing, the truth. Mr. Chairman, I plead you not just as a journalist, but as someone whose family was shattered, whose colleagues were assassinated, and whose homeland is being held hostage by tyranny. Number one, launch a formal congressional investigation into the transnational repression by the Pakistani state actors on the United States soil and provide immediate justice to my family, which is in terrible situation right now. Number two, enforce global Magnitsky sanctions on all responsible for torture, extrajudicial killing, election rigging, and censorship, including generals like Asim Munir, ISI officials, and civilian collaborators. Number three, condition all US aid, military cooperation, and financial support to Pakistan on verifiable reforms and independent judiciary, free elections, and end to the political persecution and media freedom. Publicly condemn and classify the Islamabad massacre, the killing of the journalist Arshad Sharif, and ongoing systematic torture as crimes against humanity. Today, I ask you not to rest. Stand with truth, stand with justice, stand with the people of Pakistan, and tell the tyrants your crime will not go unpunished. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Chakrabarti.
Chairman McGovern and distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. So last week, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in Canada for the G7 summit, where Prime Minister Mark Carney raised the issue of the Indian government's alleged attacks on Sikh Canadians and Americans, including the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar and surveillance of former Canadian MP Jagmeet Singh. While the U.S. government last year indicted Indian intelligence officer Vikash Yadav in a connected murder, Canadian intelligence officials also revealed that they had evidence that the North American murder plots were orchestrated by India's Home Minister Amit Shah. According to the Sikh Coalition and SALDEF, Sikh Americans continue to report credible threats against the community. These incidents are only the beginning. As we shared last year, the Indian government's transnational repression of Americans includes diverse strategies to intimidate critics both online and offline. India continues to use disinformation to intimidate critics of Modi and his Hindu nationalist government. As we and others have reported in the past, Hindu nationalist troll armies are often cultivated by the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party and other influencers in their political system. This ecosystem has directed harassment towards private individuals, and BJP leaders and cabinet ministers spread disinformation about American citizens and organizations. After the Biden administration announced criminal and civil corruption charges against leaders of the Adani Group, the BJP's official account spread anti-Semitic disinformation to intimidate U.S. officials to throw out the case against Modi's closest business ally. Earlier this year, Disinfo Labs, which is run by an Indian intelligence officer, alleged that Freedom House served as a front for shadowy Western foundations and the Five Eyes to whitewash anti-Indian terrorism through the term transnational repression. The Indian government has also tried to censor foreign critics of the Prime Minister. Both Hindus for Human Rights and Indian American Muslim Council have had our Twitter accounts withheld in India since October 2023, and Sikh Coalition's content has been withheld previously. As of this month, IAMC's Instagram account has also been withheld by the Indian government. The government of India has also begun deporting foreign journalists like Avani Diaz of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation because of a report she produced on Nijjar's death in Canada. Critics of the Indian government also often find themselves unable to enter India. As Freedom House noted last August, Kashmiri Americans in particular have borne the brunt of India's weaponization of the Indian immigration system. And as the Indian government escalates repression in Kashmir in the aftermath of the Pahalgam attack, we anticipate a new wave of repression against the Kashmiri diaspora. The Indian government targets the Indian American community comprehensively, while weaponizing a small but vocal part of the Hindu American diaspora. While these organizations may not be fronts for the Indian government, they often echo Modi's talking points and try to intimidate critics of the government. Ironically, this hearing will probably lead to more disinformation, harassment, and threats against all of us by the government of India, the BJP, and the Hindu nationalist ecosystem. However, the U.S. government can provide powerful protection against the Modi government's aggressive assault on the rights of Americans. I want to echo the recommendations that my colleagues have already made. And at HFHR, we urge Congress to also push the executive branch on a number of fronts. First, we hope you will urge Secretary Rubio to use the State Department's new visa ban against Indian officials who have censored Americans. Second, we ask you to review the intelligence from the Canadian government that allegedly proves that Home Minister Amit Shah was involved in the murder-for-hire plots in the U.S. and Canada. If the evidence proves compelling, we hope you will ask the State Department to implement a visa ban and sanctions against the Home Minister, consistent with U.S. law. Finally, we hope that you can ask the State Department to determine whether arms sales to India must be conditioned based on India's consistent pattern of intimidation and harassment of Americans, as described in Section 6 of the Arms Export Control Act. We've seen how the U.S. government responds to its foes when those enemies have undermined American safety, but we have yet to see the U.S. government hold its friends to account. Like most Indian Americans, I want the U.S. and India to have a deeper relationship. But the U.S. should not sacrifice the safety of Indian Americans who embody the U.S. and India's people-to-people ties. As you continue to engage this issue, I hope that you will continue to uplift the concerns of Indian Americans like my colleagues and myself. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Sue.
Chairman McGovern, all staff of the Commission, thank you so much for having me today and for your long-time attention on the issue of transnational repression orchestrated by the Hong Kong and Chinese governments. I was born in North Carolina and grew up in Hong Kong, where I experienced the erosion of our rights to freedoms of expression, assembly, and association. I fought back and became a target of the government, forcing me to flee Hong Kong in 2020. I then returned to the US, a place where I thought my safety would be guaranteed, only to realize that I am still not free from the reach of the Chinese and Hong Kong governments. On December 13, 2023, I woke up to the news that I had become the first and by far the only US citizen now wanted by the Hong Kong authorities for allegedly violating the national security law by colluding with foreign or external forces, which is referring to my engagement with my congressional members. They issued a $1 million Hong Kong dollar bounty for my arrest, leading to countless harassment and threats against my life, which includes a concerning number of suspicious emails I have received in January this year, offering life insurance for accidental life events and funeral and burial coverage in the event of my death. And unfortunately, as my colleagues have mentioned, this is just the tip of the iceberg. In recent years, the Chinese and Hong Kong governments have been acting in lockstep to escalate transnational repression in both scope and sophistication, which I will detail below. First, the use of bounties and international arrest warrants against activists has intensified, with currently 19 of us currently under threat. And these threats, unfortunately, are not merely symbolic. They are calculated acts designed to make engagement with advocates like myself dangerous and illegal. The aim is to intimidate us and, more importantly, isolate activists like ourselves from the broader diaspora, from those who are still on the ground inside of Hong Kong, and from our international allies. And this is mirroring the Chinese government's long-standing efforts to sever ties between Tibetans in exile and those inside of Tibet by making any forms of communication unsafe, creating a disconnect to weaken pro-democracy movements abroad and to eliminate momentum that fuels the resistance inside. Second, the implementation of the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance, which is also known as Article 23, has led to new forms of coercion, including the cancellation of passports, revocation of professional licenses, alongside vague and expanded extraterritorial charges such as external interference and theft of state secret. The colonial-era sedition law inside of Hong Kong has also continued to be weaponized to punish speech and organizing from abroad. These actions intensify the disconnect and isolation and marks a shift in focus from targeting only the outspoken, high-profile advocates to everyone and anyone within our diaspora communities. And third, the targeting of our loved ones back home. The Hong Kong police have summoned family members of wanted activists for interrogation about our activities. Our family members have been surveilled and threatened, and even recently charged under Article 23. This is hostage-taking, plain and simple. It seeks to hold our loved ones hostage to push and silence us through guilt and the ever-present threat of retaliation. This escalation against Hong Kongers echoes past tactics used by the Chinese government against exiled Uyghur and Chinese dissidents. And with this tactic of coercion by proxy, their aim to control us and politically deactivate our community through fear is very clear. The Chinese government's transnational repression doesn't stop at borders. It follows us wherever we go. The Chinese government intends to create this chilling effect, as the chairman mentioned in the beginning, so profound that speaking out even from abroad feels impossible. This is their way to normalize their authoritarian practices globally by exploiting the democracies that we have fled to, including here in the United States. And the US government must do more and faster in response. First, to prioritize transnational repression across government agencies as a key human rights and national security issue, followed by coordinated interagency response. And second, tighten enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, against entities acting on behalf of foreign governments in surveilling and silencing dissidents, including Chinese state actors and their proxies in business, media, in the diaspora, and beyond. And third, to pass the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act to shut down these offices, which have long served as unchecked political operatives and espionage tools of the Chinese government under diplomatic guise. And fourth, to maintain and increase federal funding for organizations that document, investigate, expose, and disrupt transnational repression, including the National Endowment for Democracy, Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, and more. And last but not least, but a very important one, to expand humanitarian protection pathways, because the fear of deportation for our community members leads individuals to disengage from reporting and to talking about transnational repression, silencing the very crucial and critical voices that could have informed US policy. And today I again bear this uncertain risk by testifying here before this commission, but this cause has always been bigger than myself. And as long as I have a community and have a platform, I will not be silenced. I will continue to speak out for myself, for my friends who are now behind bars, and for those who are still resisting inside of Hong Kong on the ground. And thank you again for shedding light on this issue, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Oh, thank you for being here. I thank all those who have testified for being here. It's important. And I now want to yield to Mr. Figueiredo.
Well, thank you, Chairman McGovern, for your leadership on transnational repression. While we disagree on some policies, as democracy should, I appreciate your commitment to this critical issue. My first encounter with transnational repression began in 2019, when Brazilian authorities decreed my preventive arrest in a highly politicized case involving President Trump. Though I was already legally living in the United States, Brazil placed me on Interpol's Red Notice list triggering the cancellation of my journalist visa. ICE agents took me in handcuffs to Chrome Detention Center in Florida for 17 days in a case later terminated by Brazil itself. I spent over $1 million on legal fees and endured years of immigration court battles. In 2022, Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, Brazil's current dictator masquerading as a judge, targeted me again for reporting inconvenient truths. He froze all my Brazilian assets, blocked my social media, canceled my passport, and condemned me to exile. When legal channels proved insufficient, he used back channels to have the United States FBI call me, attempting to coerce my testimony. House Judiciary Committee Chair Jim Jordan questioned this unprecedented violation in a letter to the FBI Director Christopher Wray on May 21, 2024, a letter never answered. Today, Moraes publicly insults me from Brazil's highest court, calling me a pseudo-journalist and a fugitive, though I've lived openly in Florida for 10 years. He claims there is a secret arrest warrant against me, and I cannot defend myself because I have not been formally charged, and that I don't even know if I've been placed on Interpol's list again. My case is not isolated, but part of a systematic campaign. Journalist Alan dos Santos spent over 2 years on Interpol's red notice list before his lawyers proved the Brazilian government possessed no evidence and got his name removed. When the Biden administration denied his extradition, stating that his conduct wasn't criminal in the United States, leaked dialogues revealed Moraes' judicial advisors discussing the possibility of sending operatives to kidnap Allen from U.S. soil and clandestinely transport him to Brazil. His warrant remains open in Brazil, and he continues facing millions in fines for posts made on U.S. soil. My colleague Rodrigo Constantino, an American citizen, faces similar persecution. Even award-winning journalist, American journalist Michael Schellenberger has been targeted by Moraes. Stop for a moment to contemplate the gravity of what I'm saying. We're witnessing a foreign government agent systematically persecuting American journalists and permanent residents for journalistic content published on American soil. But the persecution extends beyond journalists to democratic elected officials. Eduardo Bolsonaro, Brazil's most voted congressman and son of former President Bolsonaro, had a case opened against him by Moraes for denouncing Brazilian abuses to this very Congress. He lives here in exile now, fearing arrest upon his return. Just last month, yes, another congresswoman, Carla Zambelli, Brazil's most voted woman for Congress, had preemptive arrest decreed by Moraes. She was in the United States for medical treatment, but managed to reach Italy, where she holds Italian citizenship, before being placed on Interpol's red notice list. Sadly, 2 days later, the State Department canceled her U.S. visa. Another alarming case is that of Felipe Martins, former special advisor to President Bolsonaro. U.S. Customs and Border Protection systems falsely showed Martins had entered the United States when he was actually under surveillance in Brazil. This fabricated entry was used by Moraes to justify his 6 months imprisonment without charges. CBP later corrected the false record, but only after months of legal pressure. The case, currently in U.S. federal court, raises serious questions about potential clandestine collaboration between Brazilian authorities and elements within American law enforcement agents. Even humble citizens are unsafe. Just to give you one example, Brazilian-American housekeeper Flávia Magalhães had been arrested, decreed by Moraes, for social media posts critical of Brazil's electoral system made on American soil. Tech entrepreneurs like Chris Pavlovski, CEO of Rumble, and Elon Musk also fall victim to Moraes' systematic persecution. In fact, Moraes has attempted to transform tech companies, American tech companies, into unwitting instruments of his repression. An unknown number of Brazilians have their social media accounts blocked by his orders, including individuals residing on American territory. Tech giants like Meta, X, Google, and Rumble face threats of massive fines and executive imprisonment unless they share data about individuals on American soils with Moraes. Don't take my word for it. Similar conduct under Moraes' threats led Rumble to take the unprecedented step of suing Moraes on U.S. federal court in Florida. On February 25, 2025, U.S. federal judge Mary Scriven ruled that Moraes' orders were unenforceable in the United States and prohibited anyone from attempting to enforce them. Moraes' response was swift and vindictive. He branded CEO Chris Pavlovsky as a criminal and banned the platform entirely in Brazil. This weaponization of corporate fear contributed to X's temporary departure from Brazil in 2024, with Elon Musk remaining under investigation and even the unrelated company SpaceX being targeted. Faced with such retaliation, other companies like Google and Meta simply comply with Moraes, despite formally recognize the illegitimacy of his orders. The implications for national security are staggering. Imagine if any judge from any country in the world could order an American companies to provide data about individuals on American soil. The U.S. Department of Justice sent Brazil a warning letter dated May 7, 2025, lecturing Brazil authorities not to invade American jurisdiction. Let me reiterate my urgent warning to this Congress last year. Without decisive American action, we'll have an enormous Venezuela on steroids in South America's heart. Since then, the situation has gotten significantly worse. The United States has powerful tools like the Global Magnitsky Act for human rights violations, such as freedom of expression, press, and due process. So I urge this commission to recommend sanctions against Moraes within the next 30 days. However, these actions are insufficient. We need legislation specifically targeting transnational repression, a bipartisan imperative. This commission should also recommend that the government should also stop considering Interpol red notices for visas, pressure Interpol to adopt rigorous criteria for politically motivated cases, and create asylum exceptions for transnational repression victims. When foreign courts override First Amendment, when U.S. citizens are silenced on American speech, when our systems are manipulated against dissidents, we face an assault on American sovereignty and constitutional democracy itself. Thank you for your attention on this critical matter. I welcome your questions.
Well, thank you very much. And I just wanted to say, I think Mr. Smith is stuck on the floor, right? I mean, yeah. And anyway, I know he wanted to be here. But I have some questions here I'm going to ask, and if you could keep your answers succinct, because I'm not sure how long we have the room for, but I want to get through as many as I can. Let me begin with, to Mr. Noorani and Ms. Chakrabarti and Ms. Su. The FBI has improved its capacity to accept claims of transnational repression through its call centers and reformed its operations with a focus on transnational repression. But from a community perspective, do you feel that the FBI is responsive? What would you like to see the FBI do that they're not doing? And do you see a need for more coordination or training with local law enforcement? Yeah.
Basically, the states like Pakistan, which are involved in all this kind of repression against the dissent and against its critics, also know all these developments which are taking place across the globe or in the countries like United States. After the incident that my family faced, I approached FBI through their call center and registered all my details. And they contacted me and they interviewed me at length and asked me all kind of questions. But they asked me for very solid evidence, like video evidence of kidnapping or something like that. And to my surprise, when I contacted my family and people there in Pakistan, I came to know that special efforts were made by the special units of Pakistan Army, not at the time of kidnapping of my family, but after, one day after the kidnapping incident, the military officials remained present in the street in which my home is situated, and they ensured to take the possession of the CCTV footage from each and every house in that street, so that nobody can provide me with the CCTV footage. So these regimes, like in Pakistan, they know that what they have to do while committing these kind of acts. So they ensure that they not leave any kind of evidence. Though when my two brothers were released by the Pakistan army, and they staged a drama that they were kidnapped by some dacoits, and after a police encounter they are released. Even if they were kidnapped by some kind of dacoits, their bank accounts are blocked even today. My mother's bank account is blocked even today. There are evidences, but FBI people demand too much evidence, which they say which is crucial for them to proceed and contact the other country.
Okay.
That kind of evidence is not present in all situations. Yeah.
Ms. Chakrabarti?
Yes, so with the Indian American community, especially after the revelations that Hardeep Singh Nijjar was assassinated in Canada and the DOJ's indictment of an Indian individual in the attempted murder of Pannu, we've seen FBI field officers be really proactive and responsive and like asking about different forms of transnational repression, trying to understand the various ways in which the Indian government represses the Indian American community. And I know that our organization and our Indian American, Muslim, and Sikh colleagues have also worked directly with the FBI to make sure that those resources are available in community languages and are they're asking questions that community members can answer. But since this administration took office, one thing that has been a real concern, and I want to give some benefit of the doubt that the FBI director is not going to be a bridge between the Hindu nationalists and in the U.S., but he has expressed support for policies of the Indian government that are widely seen as being very Hindu nationalist. So, for example, the building of a temple on the grounds of a raised mosque in India. And so that has made Sikh and Muslim Americans in particular, who've already had a historically tense relationship with the FBI, again, revert back to that wariness and have extra wariness when it comes to talking about transnational repression, because they just don't know what's going to happen. And then the last thing is that in California, there's been a local or a state level bill, SB 409, and our community, the Sikh community in particular, has been really spearheading that, and it's to provide state resources and training for police officers around transnational repression.
Thank you. Ms. Sue?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. I want to acknowledge that over the past few years, with our community's advocacy and obviously the increasing awareness in the United States in regards to transnational repression, the responses and available mechanisms at the FBI have improved. However, I think the first and foremost challenge that we are facing when it comes to coordination and communication with the FBI is obviously that with the restructuring happening across government agencies and with the funding cuts, our communities are not sure if transnational repression is going to remain a priority at the FBI and other agencies. Our community members are not sure if those resources, including the hotlines that you have mentioned, are going to be retained. So I think the first and foremost thing this administration has to do is to address these concerns around whether or not TNR will remain a priority and will be followed by concrete actions and mechanisms made available at FBI and other agencies. And I think secondly, in regards to, some of the gaps that the FBI can continue to improve on, I think one of the very important things would be to diversify the language availability at the FBI. A lot of our community members, they feel more comfortable communicating in Cantonese, Mandarin, Uyghur, Tibetan when it comes to reporting cases of transnational repression. I think making those language services available would be very important. And then I will also recommend that that we set up more resources in regards to to survivor-informed, support for targets of transnational repression within our communities. A lot of our policy focus have been focused on identifying TNR and in terms of communicating on TNR. However, I think there is definitely this lack of resources made available to support victims of TNR in America. And last but not least, I will also just say that, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned at the very beginning the report produced by Students for a Free Tibet and the Hong Kong Democracy Council about the TNR that unfolded in San Francisco during Xi Jinping's visit to APEC last year. And that really exposed, I think, the lack of understanding of TNR and the lack of training that was, made available to local law enforcement. San Francisco is a huge community with, huge Chinese, Hong Kong, Tibetan, Uyghur populations. And even for a city like that, they lack the resources and understanding. And I can't imagine what the situation is like in other states across America. So I definitely do think that training and collaboration between FBI and other local law enforcement has to be made available as well. Thank you.
And I also think that, Congress can be helpful if we pass legislation, like we're trying to draft as we speak, basically to kind of set the guidelines and the rules. And I mean, there's issues of, there's some things the FBI can do better. We can't put too much responsibility and burden on the victims to come up with all the evidence, especially given the nature of transnational repression. And then there's, quite frankly, there are suspicions about where some in this administration are coming from, and I think that may but that's why legislation, that's why if Congress could come together and act, I think that would be really helpful. Ms. Noorani and
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Can I add something, a different perspective on the FBI? Our concern is a little bit different, is about the FBI cooperating with foreign governments informally in some cases, not only FBI, but other law enforcement agents. In my case, I had FBI agents calling me informally, trying to coerce me to testify in a Brazilian case without following the proper channels that Brazil had to follow, the multilateral agreement that Brazil has with the United States, and trying to coerce me to, because most people, if you receive a call from the FBI, you get coerced. And we had one case of one person that actually testified before the Brazilian federal police in the United States in a Department of Justice building because of an informal call made from the FBI. We have a more concerning case that I just mentioned about CBP that we know for a fact that included false information in the United States immigration system about an entry of the former advisor of President Bolsonaro, Felipe Martins. That was used by the Brazilian government to imprison him for 6 months. And that was, we know for a fact it was false, and the case is pending on U.S. federal court. So my concern is from a different perspective. It's not what the FBI is not doing to prevent transnational repression, but is the FBI cooperating informally on transnational repression.
Mr. Noorani and Ms. Gorovskaya, I'm going to get this right by the time this hearing's over. The report of Irene Khan, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, told the UN Human Rights Council last year that, and I quote, international human rights and refugee law provide a strong framework to protect journalists in exile. In practice, however, the individuals remain highly vulnerable because of the failure of states, both origin and host countries, to uphold their international obligations. There is no international legal gap, but there is a dangerous protection gap. So the report calls on states to take action to protect journalists at risk of transnational repression and promote the norm supporting the valuable role of independent public service media, including exiled journalists in promoting democracy, development, and human rights. Mr. Noorani, how would you assess the U.S. government's record to protect you specifically, and also to create a climate in which journalists and journalism is respected and worthy of protection? And Ms. Gorovskaya, how would you rate the U.S. government on defending freedom of the press?
So basically, I can't say that U.S. government has not helped me. I might not have been alive today if the U.S. government not allowed me to enter in the country and have not allowed me to live here as a legal resident. So I am all thankful to the U.S. government. But the issue is that we are discussing right now the transnational repression. So if any journalist working from here and reporting professionally, or producing professional journalistic work, how he or his family can be targeted. If that journalist provides undeniable evidence of targeting of his family or the attacks on his family, the United States should at least take up the issue with the said government. Or if there are so many incidents of this kind coming from the same country, I think different kind of sanctions should be imposed on such countries, because there are not so many countries which are doing so. I think there are a few right now where there are these kind of regimes which violate human rights on continuous basis, and especially target dissent and media. So the answer to your question is the US government has really helped me out in a very difficult situation, but it saved my life, but my family or my associates or my profession or my colleagues are obviously in a very dangerous situation in Pakistan, and US government is not able to help those people who are living there in any way. And obviously I have to self-censor myself just to save the lives of those who are associated with me.
Ms. Gorokovskaya?
Thank you. Gorohovskaya. I don't know if that's helpful or not. I would say...
I'm way off.
I think it's just the emphasis is on the wrong part. I would say that the U.S. government has done a lot for exiled journalists up until very recently. What I'm specifically concerned about now are the journalists working for Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, Radio Liberty. These outlets employ journalists working in exile who are in exile from very dangerous repressive regimes, whether that's Pakistan, whether it's Cambodia, Vietnam, even China, and they are now facing the loss of their work, but also the loss of their immigration status. And many are at risk of being arrested if they have to go back home. So I think that is a huge concern. And I would say that the other thing that does not get, I think, enough attention when it comes to the targeting of journalists, rightfully we look at cases of physical attacks. Those are obviously very serious. But exiled media is undermined every day through digital attacks, through attacks on their finances. These are methods to make sure that they cannot continue their work. And for that, they also need financial support. They need, interaction with tech companies to make sure that this doesn't continue. And so I think that the U.S. could do a lot more to protect freedom of the media and to be a safe country for journalists working in exile from, unfortunately, an increasing number of countries around the world.
Are you worried about the U.S. president's attacks on American journalists daily, and how that is interpreted by other countries that don't like journalists who criticize them? I mean, is that a concern that that you have? Because I mean, again, part of this is we have to lead by example, and I've been somewhat taken aback by the targeting of individual journalists, many of who have been journalists for years, and how it has become very dangerous for them. That's here in the United States.
I'm extremely worried about attacks on freedom of expression. Another project I lead at Freedom House, our Freedom in the World Index, which tracks political rights and civil liberties across all countries and territories in the world, and has been doing that since 1973, shows that freedom of expression is the indicator that has declined the most over the last 19 years of global decline in freedom, but the leading indicator is freedom of expression, specifically freedom of the media. And freedom of the media, I think, attacks in authoritarian countries look like physical assault, imprisonment, these direct attacks on journalists, attacks in democratic countries on the media look like slap suits, they look like specific targeting of journalists, they look like smear campaigns, and I think they are also extremely dangerous.
Ms. Su, Anna Kwok of the Hong Kong Democracy Council and Francis Hui of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong are two advocates who have helped lobby for the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act, which Co-Chair Smith and I led and it passed the House last year. And I know that relatives of Anna and Francis were recently arrested and taken for questioning. Can you give us any update on their families?
Thank you for the question, Chairman. First of all, I want to applaud you and thank you for introducing again the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act. I think that is a very, very important legislation that, as you know, our community have been advocating so hardly for since last year, the first introduction, and hopefully we do want to see that legislation being passed in this Congress. ETOs have long been used as a backdoor for foreign political influence here in the United States to advance the Chinese government's interest in Washington, D.C. They have spent a total of over 200 million just to lobby for policies and then to influence public opinion in favor of the Chinese government. So I think that really speaks to the importance of having that legislation passed to stop these offices from continuing to operate in the United States as espionage tools by the Beijing government. I think that's very important. And then to your point on our family members and friends being taken as hostages back in Hong Kong, I think that is a trend that we are seeing as an increasingly common tactic employed by the Hong Kong government, which I think is very concerning because we do see this parallel to what the Chinese government have been using for the past decades against Uyghur activists, Chinese dissidents, and the Tibetan community. We have seen how Gulshan Abbas, who is also part of, I believe, the Defending Human Rights Project by this commission, how she was being taken into interrogation and disappeared for what her sister, Uyghur American activist Rushan Abbas, have spoken in regards to the Uyghur genocide at the Hudson Institute. And then last year, Elvadar of Uyghur American Association also spoke about how family members of Uyghur Americans have been forced to do WeChat calls to pressure their family members here in America to stop from attending congressional hearings, events, so that they would not be sent to concentration camps. I think that really speaks to the seriousness and then a trend that we are witnessing in Hong Kong. I do think it is very, very important that this Congress and this administration take the according actions and then to implement the accountability mechanisms that we have available to stop the Hong Kong government and Chinese government from furthering, employing this tactic.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Chakrabarti, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, USCIRF, has recommended for the 6th year in a row that the State Department designate India as a country of particular concern, CPC, for engaging in and tolerating systemic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations, including transnational repression against Sikhs in North America. The State Department has never accepted this recommendation, despite its own extensive reporting on religious freedom violations in India. In your opinion, does India meet the CPC threshold, and what does that tell us about the U.S. government's ability to hold India accountable for transnational repression?
Thank you for that question. And yes, India by all measures meets the threshold to be designated as a CPC. In the past, when we've asked about this decision, we've received answers from both administrations saying that the U.S.-India relationship is too broad, it's too important to do this. It would somehow damage the U.S.-India relationship. But we know, that many partners of the U.S., whether that's Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, are on the CPC list because of violations of religious freedom that happen. And even though the U.S.-India relationship goes beyond just this one issue, it is important to say that there are consequences politically to this kind of persecution of religious minorities in India, and the fact that as the Indian government closes up spaces for dissent inside India, it's now trying to do the same to the Indian diaspora, and that there are consequences for that. CPC is one of those tools to at least start the process of saying, like, actually, you can't persecute minorities or even people who criticize the Indian government if they're Hindu American, both in the US and in India. And so I think this is one of many tools, and there are ways in which you can still push for a stronger US-India relationship while still using this tool to hold the Indian government to account.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, by the way, this happens in Republican and Democratic administrations. There's sometimes seems to be double standards on when we speak out against human rights violations and when we don't. And yes, we want a good relationship with countries like India. There's no question about that. But I would like to think we could still pursue that and still be a strong voice and an advocate for human rights. And because when you have I enforce, I'll talk about human rights here, but not here, even though we all agree that there are human rights violations, then you start losing credibility on this issue. And I always have thought if the United States is supposed to stand for anything, we're supposed to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. And Ms. Kozlovska, you raised the case of Barlik, if I pronounce this right.
Mendegaziev.
Mendegaziev, right. And how his brother has been imprisoned in Kazakhstan in retaliation for Barlik's advocacy, as documented in the State Department's annual human rights report, and how their financial services were terminated by U.S. financial institutions. What specific actions do you ask that the U.S. government take on their behalf, whether it's justice, treasury, or state?
Thank you so much for this question. And first of all, we would like to advise the Congress to request a Government Accountability Office and FinCEN into investigation of transnational financial repression, examining how anti-money laundering, counterterrorism regulations, cybersecurity frameworks are weaponized by authoritarian regimes against US-based civil society organizations, charities, philanthropist entities, philanthropists like private people like Barlik Mendegaziev, and investors and US citizens. And this investigation should evaluate how US compliance policies and financial intelligence sharings enabling politically motivated exclusion, civilians, with findings which afterwards has to be reflected in State Department human rights reports. And one of the most important things is also, of course, accountability. So we advise that US should impose global Magnitsky sanctions on Kazakhstani officials involved in extraterritorial targeting of the US entities, residents, through anti-money laundering and counterterrorism regulations, cybersecurity abuse. And we call Commission to help secure release of political hostage Bekirjan Mendegaziev. Thank you.
Well, okay, in your testimony, it calls for the Treasury Department to issue a financial crimes enforcement network advisory highlighting foreign governments' misuse of anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism financing tools to target U.S. entities and residents in transnational repression. Has the State Department, as a department, as a Treasury Department, have they made any steps in this regard? If not, what do you think is a productive pressure point? And do you believe that the United States is currently a safe haven for human rights defenders? Or have these regulatory abuses created an environment where even legitimate civil society work faces financial persecution? I mean, do you feel safe operating in the United States?
Unfortunately, I don't feel safe operating in the United States, but also in other Western jurisdictions because of very sophisticated ability with no regulatory remedies provided right now in Western jurisdictions against this kind of transnational financial repression from the side of authoritarian regimes. So for this reason, we really advised to request at Treasury and FinCEN to highlight how exactly foreign regimes misuse anti-money laundering, counterterrorism regulations, cybersecurity tools to target both U.S. citizens, entities, and not to share intelligence information with those regimes who violated or recorded already that they violated and abuse these important instruments for political prosecutions. Myself, for example, we also expose this Open Dialogue Foundation how sanctions are evaded. So we have a case which Open Dialogue Foundation, myself, legally harassed in Western legal systems, including we expect a legal request here in US because of, for example, Russian allies like Kyrgyz Bakai Bank suing Open Dialogue Foundation for our reports where we exposing how sanctions were circumvented with support of financial institutions from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. There is a number of evidences how authoritarian regimes threaten donors and discourage financial support for pro-democracy movements, watchdogs, and humanitarian work. And again, on my urban experience, because Russia, for example, classified us as that we possess threat to constitutional order, defense capacity, and security, again, because of our humanitarian work and support for Ukraine, and also exposing sanctions evasion. They prosecute me personally and extend my family members also here in US, those who are facing financial exclusion also in US and other jurisdictions, so basically transnationally. And we need to develop effective regulatory and legislative remedies against such practices.
Okay, I have another Freedom House question. Freedom House is the leading NGO in Washington on transnational repression. In addition to your database and working group coordination, you have given invaluable input to the Transnational Repression Policy Act that Co-Chair Smith and I introduced. And Freedom House, however, has been hit by the Trump administration's funding cuts administered by Secretary Marco Rubio, who ironically was the co-lead on the Senate version of our bill. And Freedom House's website says, quote, a new program approved by the U.S. State Department in October 2024 would have allowed us to work with partners on 5 continents to develop innovative, effective, locally responsive ways of stopping transnational repression in places where it is most common and most dangerous for dissidents. This program was terminated less than 4 months after it began. The cancellation of this and related programs will set back the United States' efforts to prevent authoritarian actors from attacking and intimidating people living in democratic nations. That's from your website. I mean, do you agree? I mean, how has this partner organization, how has this affected partner organizations in countries where you have worked? For those in authoritarian states, has the funding cut added to their risk?
Well, our own work on transnational repression has been greatly affected. So the program that you cite, we had just gotten it off the ground, and in fact, what we were doing was scoping work in the countries that we selected. We selected a group of countries based on how many dissidents and diasporas lived in those countries and how receptive the governments of those countries were to policy progress on transnational repression. And in fact, we were doing scoping work on the ground, figuring out who our partners would be. A lot of this work is based on trust and knowledge and connections. And unfortunately, then that work, is not going to continue. And I think that diasporas in those countries are more exposed to transnational repression without this type of work. And I would say also our capacity to just track transnational repression. I mean, I'm so grateful to you, Chairman, and others who have quoted our research on transnational repression, including our database. But our work on that is also challenging because our staff has shrunk. In fact, all of the people who work on transnational repression at Freedom House are in this room right now. There are 3 of us. And so tracking this global phenomenon has just become incredibly difficult, and we know that it's not decreasing. And I think our biggest concern is that if the U.S. steps back on work on transnational repression, both adversaries and our partner countries will feel emboldened. As I mentioned, 48 governments engage in tactics of transnational repression, and those are just the ones that we know of physical tactics. I would expect that the number is higher. And so it's not just about funding, it's also about taking a leadership role internationally on this issue.
Thank you. Ms. Sue, you have worked at the National Democratic Institute. one of the core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy, which the Trump administration is now seeking to eliminate. How do the activities of the NED, Radio Free Asia, and the Voice of America help address transnational repression in the United States? Do they help us understand how relatives of America are punished under TNR inside Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I am here obviously in my Amnesty International capacity. Amnesty International does not receive any kinds of governmental funding, but as I have mentioned, as my colleague from Freedom House has mentioned, this funding cut has greatly impacted nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations, and the civil society as a whole in terms of our capacity to document, investigate, expose, and to disrupt transnational repression happening not just in the US, but elsewhere across the world as well. As I have mentioned, addressing transnational repression, I think, really requires a collective effort from all sectors of the society. It wouldn't be possible that we address the issue of TNR simply by the efforts invested by the FBI or the Department of Homeland Security. That just would not be possible. There are so many areas that the government agencies cannot effectively reach due to barriers, as I have mentioned, related to language, capacity, and expertise. And this is where civil society organizations really come into place and are best positioned to fill these gaps. The report that you have mentioned at the very beginning, Mr. Chairman, I think that is a great example of how civil society efforts can help, identify TNR happening on American soil. And as my colleagues here have also mentioned, over the past few years, media agencies, including the Radio Free Asia, VOA, and then the others, have did such an outstanding job with their impressive journalism to expose these TNR campaigns happening in the US and elsewhere, because these stories very often mainstream medias may not be able to pick them up and then to write in details about what has been unfolding within our communities. It was only for RFA and VOA's efforts that these stories were able to be reported and cited in governmental research and documentation about TNR. And last but not least, I will also want to mention that, the National Endowment for Democracy, as you have mentioned, have been greatly impacted by this funding cut. It was only for the net efforts and grants that our governments were able to identify the secret police stations that were in operation in New York and elsewhere. It was only for the net support that our civil society organizations were able to map out TNR activities happening in our country, and that could inform policy recommendations that will inform our national security and human rights policy. So I do think it is very important that we maintain and increase federal funding for these agencies immediately.
Sure, okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
the flip side of that, as you correctly mentioned, that sometimes the United States government has a double standard dealing with transnational repression and freedom of speech and other issues, is that in Brazil, the National Endowment of Democracy was crucial to actually implement all the measures to persecute journalists. They were the ones that funded all the disinformation combat programs that were used and weaponized by Justice Moraes and other justices of the Brazilian Supreme Court and Superior Electoral Court to censor journalists. So we can even talk about specifically partnerships that they had with Brazilian NGOs to monitor the internet and pretty much censor constitutionally protected speech. And all that affected not only Brazilians, but United States citizens. So the flip side of what she's saying is that for the Brazilian case specifically, the funds being cut for the NED actually helped promoting more free speech. And I think this has everything to do with what you said about the double standard of the U.S. government, depending on the administration.
I appreciate that, and we can maybe disagree on that. But let me ask just another question here. Maybe this is to Mr. Noorani and Ms. Sue and Ms. Chakrabarti. Diaspora groups are often the target of transnational repression, as we've heard here today. But sadly, they can also include perpetrators of transnational repression offenses. We want law enforcement to engage with diaspora committee members to gather information, provide resources, and create avenues for protection. But we must also admit that scrutiny can come with risks from overzealous police forces or politicization. Many civil rights advocates concluded the now abandoned China initiative of the Justice Department led to racial profiling, intolerance, and discrimination against people of Chinese heritage. As policymakers, what guidelines should we consider for law enforcement to help protect anti-TNR efforts from developing into weapons of bias? And is there any way that we can help diaspora communities to develop resilience against fear and divisions caused by rumors of infiltrators in the community?
So basically, I think I will not be able to give a suggestion that how the working of the law enforcement in the United States can be improved to help on this count. My understanding is this, that this is an issue which can be dealt at the government level because the law enforcement can help us here. The transnational repression is about something happening in some other jurisdiction, in some other country. So basically, the policy of the government needs to be changed. And I think you know it better, that what needs to be changed. I am no one to ask United States to have relations with only the democratic countries and not have relations with the dictatorships. But I can say that United States should at least consider it very seriously while making any kind of relationship with any dictator who is acting as a criminal, and even any civilian ruler who is acting as a criminal, who is violating human rights in his country or in her country. So in case of Pakistan, like the army chief Asim Munir, who is running the show, who is running the government, is facing charges of killing dozens of people in last few months, and he was welcomed in the White House simply few days back. So these kind of things, they just encourage such kind of tyrants in their countries to expedite whatever they are doing, encourage them to do more atrocities against their own citizens. So the answer to your question is, I think more than improving the law enforcement inside the United States, this issue of transnational repression has more to do with improving the legislation and coming up with a very good policy at the government end, that United States may continue to have any kind of relations with any country, but at least where there are very clear indications or instances of human rights violations or torture or killings, at least United States should take up those matters with the concerned governments, continuing routine or normal relationship, but at least keep on taking up those issues, especially the issues of torture or killings or transnational repression, which involve the people who are living on the United States soil.
Mr. Chakrabarti?
So there's a lot here. I think one of the things that we've been struggling with is, how do you get the U.S. government or any government to dream of like a TNR response that keeps communities safe but doesn't necessarily inspire overzealous law enforcement, which could lead to over-surveillance, right. Especially for religious minority communities in this country. And so a few things that have been useful, right? One is that the Department of Justice, before DOJ took away many departments inside, or different offices inside the Department of Justice, the Community Relations Office was a really great conduit for a lot of these kinds of meetings where civil society could come together. There was a Middle Eastern, North African, South Asian, Sikh, Muslim, Hindu roundtable, the Masa roundtable, where we would meet with like the Department of Justice's community relations staffs would convene this roundtable, and we would meet with all parts of the Department of Justice, including the FBI, about community concerns. And that's gone now, and so having those kinds of avenues open was really useful at that time, and if those kinds of offices can be restored, that would be very useful for restoring that kind of trust. It makes it feel like our communities have a seat at the table. One thing that lawmakers can certainly do is be a conduit, for some of these interactions, kind of say, here's a community that is concerned, here are their concerns that they have about transnational repression, and encouraging police to move away from surveillance strategies and more towards community input strategies. And for us too, as civil society, kind of asking for those kinds of tools where community input is put in rather than asking for surveillance or kind of punitive measures. Part of this also requires like regulating tech companies and making sure that they're not complying with censorship requests abroad, holding foreign governments accountable through legislation, and more education broadly on what are the community dynamics within a certain community. So for instance, with the Hindu American community, there are a lot of organizations that have Hindu in the name, but may have a very specific political bent to them and will represent one part of the Hindu American community. Many Hindu Americans also don't necessarily identify with or like organize themselves into organizations that have Hindu in the name, but may find themselves more comfortable in broadly Indian American or South Asian American or even cultural associations. And it's important for anybody in government to really hear from them. And the last thing I would say is that, you know, with the responses to like transnational repression coming from the Indian government, they've been primarily Department of Justice focused responses, and the State Department and the Department of Defense and other parts of the US government have kind of taken in that information, but haven't then used that to regulate the way those parts of the US-India relationship should be affected. And I think that's another really important tool to hold the Indian government and other governments to account.
Sue?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman. I would just want to note, first of all, that I have never worked for the net, but if you look at the public records made available by the net and its core institutions, all of the work that these institutions have done over the past decades with civil society organizations across the world have been bipartisan without political bias. I think it is very important that we note that there has not been any kinds of politically biased programs implemented by the net and its core institutions. I think we can agree to disagree politically, but I do think that it is very important that we disagree with disinformation. I want to first note that. And then second, to your question, I think when we talk about, how do we prevent the risk of, police surveillance, I think it is that is also why it is so important that we integrate the community and civil society perspective in terms of addressing transnational repression in the U.S. and elsewhere. I think when we only rely on law enforcement and governmental branches to address TNR in this country, that leads to potentially the endless expansion of law enforcement powers, which then increases the risk of surveillance by the police or other governmental agencies. So I think this is where community perspectives and civil society-led efforts really come into place. It is so important that we solicit the advantages and expertise that community members have, their experiences of TNR, their analysis of TNR, to be integrated into our policy implementations to be able to address TNR not just from a governmental law enforcement perspective, but then really a whole of government approach. Thank you.
May I respond to the NED thing?
Yes.
Very briefly. I can't speak about other countries. I can speak about Brazil. In Brazil, all the NED money was directed to combat disinformation only for conservative, only for President Bolsonaro supporters. So I can say for a fact that in Brazil, the NED had a very partisan role, and it's sad, and I hope it doesn't happen anymore.
So let me tell you what we're going to do. I have a couple of more questions that whoever wants to answer, just raise your hand, and because I think all of you, might have some perspectives, or some of you may not want to answer them. And then I'll give everybody a couple of minutes to say anything you want to say on the record that hasn't been asked or that you think is important for this hearing. And so, that may take another 15 minutes, if that's okay with all of you. All right, good. All right. So look, at promoting accountability and legal recourse against transnational repression compels us not only to strengthen laws, but also to create norms against TNR to allow for accountability and effective mechanisms of remedy and reparation for victims. The OHCHR fact sheet calls on us to, quote, ensure that extradition procedures are transparent, efficient, take into account international human rights and refugee law safeguards, and guarantee compliance with the prohibition of refoulement and respect for fair trial. end quote. The current administration has not followed transparency and due process in sending people to the CCOT prison in El Salvador. Most of the 238 Venezuelan migrants it sent there in mid-March had not been convicted of any crime in the United States, but they deported them anyway. And the administration has also canceled humanitarian parole for Venezuelans and Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans, making them vulnerable to deportation and harm if returned to Venezuela. Does the United States government have credibility to help protect victims of TNR against extradition when it is engaging in that practice itself? Just raise your hand if you want to. Yeah, Mr. Nur.
I mean, this administration has started taking this kind of action, which is obviously condemnable. But we can't say that we should stop fighting against the transnational repression. I mean, there is a government, then there is the legislature, there are organizations, civil rights organizations. The fight against the transnational repression can continue at many levels. If this government is not taking up that seriously, we should persuade the government, we should pressurize the government, we should convince the government that it must do that. It must stop having that kind of relations with those countries which are involved in these kind of terrorism activities. This is something in which the countries create an atmosphere of fear and terror in the hearts of the people, in hearts of the citizens, and control the people through terror. And that terror is directly connected with this transnational repression. You are right, there are many problems at present with the US government, but obviously US has to fight against the transnational repression. US has to fight.
Yeah, no, and I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't. I'm just suggesting in terms of how our complaints of transnational repression are viewed by countries or taken seriously by countries when we engage in these kinds of things. Two people raised their hand. Ms. Sue, and we'll go right down, yeah.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I think a lot of the things that this administration is doing is undermining our moral authority to speak about issues on human rights, TNR, that is happening, occurring on the ground in Hong Kong, in China, and elsewhere. I think, when we have, police officers who are on the ground in Los Angeles aiming and shooting the Australian journalist simply for reporting about the protest, when we're sending legal residents of the United States without due process to, a foreign country, I think this really undermines our moral authority to talk about the detention of Jimmy Lai, who is currently in prison for over 1,000 days inside of Hong Kong. That undermines our moral authority to talk about, China's illiberal influence everywhere across the world. When our community members, not just from the Hong Kong community or the Chinese communities, but from other communities as well, are so fearful that they are going to be arrested all of a sudden by ICE agents, they're not going to talk to the FBI or the Department of Homeland Security about TNR cases happening in America. They're going to be hiding in their homes, not talking to any governmental agencies about these countries' illiberal influences happening in our countries. So I think this is so important. This is why it is so important that when we talk about human rights, when we talk about democracy and freedoms, that we lead by action, not just by words. Words are public statements that are not followed by concrete policy actions or actions that respect and defend human rights and democracy are meaningless. And specifically in the case of Hong Kong, when our communities are seeing the revocation of temporary protected statuses for the Venezuelan and other communities, our community members are fearful that our friends and colleagues, DED status under the Deferred and Forced Departure Program are going to be taken away anytime. So I do really hope that Congress and this administration would figure out a way to work in a bipartisan manner to increase protection measures for our community members who are vulnerable and at the risk right now of deportation and would face, imprisonment if deported back to Hong Kong, China, and elsewhere.
Ms. Chakrabarti?
So with your question, the first thing I thought of was right after Trump was inaugurated, Indian activists and journalists said basically, well, welcome to what we've been facing for the last decade. And that has been true. I think what the president has done so far looks very similar to what India looked like in 2019. But even so, and even given, quite frankly, I think the U.S. lost a lot of its human rights credibility with the actions of like backing the Israeli government as it has committed atrocious war crimes in Gaza. Even so, when the U.S. and particularly when members of Congress speak out about human rights issues and transnational repression, it does create an impact. So last year when Secretary Blinken talked about India as having committed egregious religious freedom violations, the opposition in India started also talking about the state of religious minorities in India. And so members of Congress have a role to play, even as the Trump administration may engage in these issues, to engage, even as the Trump administration engages in what we could characterize as transnational repression, for members of Congress to be kind of a vocal bulwark against that, and to say that like this is not okay, to bring bills up, to protest in the way that like Senator Padilla had done, or like Comptroller Lander in New York City had done earlier this year, or earlier this month actually. Those actions matter, and that shows that there is at least people in power who are willing to stand against transnational repression, and they have credibility that can carry over to people who are fighting for democracy in their home countries and other countries as well.
Anybody else want to say? I mean, the final question I was going to ask, many of you have already answered, and that is, do you see a difference in how the U.S. government approaches cases of transnational repression when committed by governments that are considered strategic partners and allies, and when committed by unfriendly governments? And just, to ask just how important it is to apply consistent standards against transnational repression. And other places, I think in India, we've fallen short, right? I don't know whether anybody wants to comment on any of that, but I do think, again, I think credibility is important when you're trying to be effective. And if it looks like you're politicizing who you're helping and who you're not helping, and who you're protecting and who you're not protecting, I think that's problematic for our effectiveness in combating transnational repression. But you're not a witness, so I can't call on you. But I appreciate it. We had audience participation. But let me give you all the last word. To say whatever you want to say for the record. Again, I know Congressman Smith wanted to be here, and this was one of these screwy days that none of us anticipated. So, but I've found this all very, very, very helpful. So why don't we just kind of go across, Mr. Figueiredo? Why don't we begin with you, and we'll just work our way across the panel and say whatever you want to say for the record, and just take a couple of minutes.
I'll be very brief. First of all, I think this is a bipartisan issue, and was very impressed hearing the testimony of my colleagues with very different backgrounds, but it looks like the tactics of transnational repressions are very similar, and that the United States still does not have the proper legislation to deal with. So I'd like to commend you, Mr. Chairman, on your efforts with your co-chairs, Smith, about this, trying to fight this issue. I think this is still the freest country in the world. I feel very safe here being a journalist. I have been feeling very safe, the safest I can be in any country. And unfortunately, that's not the truth for all my Brazilian friends, and not because of the actions of the United States government against us, but because of the actions against the Brazilian government against us. And that double standard that you mentioned is absolutely true. Brazil is the largest democracy in the Southern Hemisphere. it's not actually a democracy anymore, but it used to be. And we're in a very sad situation right now. I could talk about several human rights violations, from due process against regular people. We have over 1,000 political prisoners in Brazil. We have journalists, we have congressmen being censored. We have everything that you see in a dictatorship, but some people still does not treat Brazil as a dictatorship as it is right now. We're seeing more and more coverage of the press. A couple of weeks ago, I'd say less than a month ago, Secretary Rubio said that he was evaluating applying the Magnitsky Global Act against Alexandre de Moraes, who is the de facto dictator of Brazil. And I just want to say that we hope that this happens very fast, because the country's at the turning point, and if the United States doesn't act fast enough, I think we'll be at the point of no return. The president of Brazil, the former president of Brazil, who is leading all the polls for the 2026 election, is at the brink of being in prison on false and political accusations, and all his supporters are being persecuted some way or the other. And all this started with a lot of support from the Biden administration. So I just hope that it's not a matter of a partisan issue. I just hope the United States reverse its course and start using its foreign policy to promote what always done, which is democracy and freedom.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm glad you feel safe as a journalist in the United States. I'm not sure I feel very safe as a politician in the United States, but that's the reality.
Do you have any politicians arrested in the United States? We have two of the most voted congressmen.
You just saw a sitting United States senator tackled to the ground and handcuffed.
Yeah.
And you're seeing people targets of political assassination in this country. So I mean, I'm just telling you.
You're welcome to go to Brazil and give it a try. It's much worse.
I'm trying to
there.
save our democracy. Ms. Sue.
Unfortunately, just like you, Mr. Chairman, I do not feel safe, being in my own country. I can still feel the long arms of the Hong Kong and Chinese government extending over my head. Every day I receive, harassment messages and threats against my life. And, my partner, who is also in the audience, is a Hong Kong organizer from Massachusetts. He has been organizing, solidarity protests for Hong Kong since 2019. And since 2019, there have been, massive orchestrated counter-protests, clearly supported by the Chinese consulate and then their state-affiliated actors, threatening violence or even, the usage of guns against these pro-democracy activists who are simply trying to speak out for Hong Kong, for our deserved human rights and, freedoms and democracy. And 6 years have passed. It is currently 2025, and we're still not seeing sufficient, strong enough policy actions and response from our own government. I do not feel safe. I do not feel protected by our government, and I think that really speaks to the seriousness of, stronger and more comprehensive TNR policies, both in terms of the executive branch and in terms of the legislative branch. And I think, as I have mentioned, there are, so many concerns within our communities as in whether or not TNR will remain a policy priority of this administration. I do really hope that following this hearing, I do really hope that the administration will take, the recommendations by myself and my other witnesses into account, into really responding to China's expanding illiberal influence in our country, to address, the expanding TNR campaigns happening against high-profile activists as well as other members of our communities. And I will also want to take this opportunity to just again to urge, members of the Congress to support, to co-sponsor the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act and to pass it as soon as possible. Last year, we were able to advance it to the Senate, and unfortunately, as the last term of Congress was ending, we were not able to get it passed and signed into law. And I really hope that in this Congress, we will be able to see the legislation proposals signed into law, and we see that these offices are shut down and will no longer be able to operate on American soil. soil as the Chinese government's, political operatives and espionage tool. I think that's very important. And last but not least, I will also want to advocate for more permanent, humanitarian protection pathways for members of my Hong Kong diaspora community and all other members of our diaspora communities currently facing TNR and oppression by the Chinese government. I think it is so important that we expand these pathways to people and victims experiencing TNR for voicing for their support and our deserved rights for our community members. And again, I would like to thank you for your continued attention and support to our communities. And I really hope that this hearing will be followed by these concrete policy actions. Thank you.
So on the question of safety, I'm a U.S. citizen. I am from a Hindu community. I feel more safe than a lot of other. I feel more safe than maybe most Indian Americans who are facing TNR. But that's not the case for a lot of people. And one thing that I think I alluded to in my remarks but want to mention is that many people who are Indian passport holders who are Kashmiri, they have had notices that their passports have been impounded and that they have to surrender them. And this is, I know, something that other diaspora groups have also faced from other governments. And so for people who may be criticizing the Indian government and who are Kashmiri, they will face statelessness, and oftentimes they're often talking about other issues that face Muslim Americans in this country as well, and could face deportation because of many of the things that they do. And I also know that we've talked a lot about what more can the U.S. government do to fill gaps that exist. And I absolutely agree with all of that. In the case of India, though, one thing that we've been frustrated by is that some of the tools that are already available that have been used against, say, Chinese officials or Russian officials haven't been used against Indian officials that we have evidence have been involved in TNR in some way. And so, yes, we do need to close all of these gaps, but we also need the political will to hold particularly officials from partner governments to account for actions that enemy governments also do. Thank you.
And maybe we can work with you on some specifics. Make sure your mic.
First of all, let me say that I'm really impressed by the presentations of my friends here. I really honor their great work that they are doing through their organization. I am also feeling really strange that I am sitting for the first time in my life with someone who has a bounty of $1 million on her. By the way, I just want to bring in your notice that bad actors anywhere in the world produce bad people, and bad people like terrorists are not good for this world. The dictators have only this thing in their favor, that they create such kind of characters in the societies. They try to, you can say, suppress people, the people's freedom by creating proxies, by creating, you can say, extremist groups, and then control the overall dissent. They create terror in the societies, an atmosphere of fear in the societies by creating terrorist groups or extremist groups, not for the other world, but to control their own people. This is the case in Pakistan, where military is involved in these kind of activities. We have seen in the past many such instances in case of Pakistan. The United States, due to many reasons, has supported Pakistani dictators in past just for the short-term objectives, which is a very wrong policy, I believe. The support of the United States for the dictators or the army generals in Pakistan is something very bad for the people of Pakistan, who are continuously facing the wrath of the military generals, the suppression, the oppression, and there is no stop. There is no full stop to any of this. And the main support that the military general in Pakistan has is the support of the government in Washington, D.C. So the policy of the United States government has to be changed someday in a way that it may continue to have its diplomatic relations with such countries, but at least it should take on any government in Islamabad or the military generals in Islamabad for any serious human rights violations, like killing of several people in one day for just protesting, like killing the journalists in other countries, like attacking the families of the journalists who are living in the United States of America, their families being attacked or they are being kidnapped or they are being tortured just because of this thing. I think the last thing that I want to say is that if a case is taken up of transnational repression, that must not be dropped, even if that person goes behind or drops that charges. The government of the United States should continue to ask if there is substantial evidence of that kind of torture or killing, and should continue to take on the governments like the government of Pakistan. I'm really thankful for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, and I would like to say that over the last 15 years of my human rights work, the last 10 years I was constantly transnationally repressed with different kind of means. And every time we overcome this kind of transnational repression with different means used, for example, by Kazakhstani or Kyrgyzstani regime or Moldovan in the past, we observe one trend: lack of accountability provoke further and further more sophisticated way how, for example, Kazakhstani regime or Russian proxies like Bakai Bank from Kyrgyzstan using different tactics to prosecute us for our human rights or our watchdog activities. For this reason, I want to say that we have to, from one side, work for legislative remedies, but from other side, we need to have an instrument to raise awareness. And for example, US State Department Human Rights Report was one of the main tools for this kind of raising awareness, what different tactics every time evaluating were used by different countries against civil society representatives. Right now, we haven't seen the last year report, and we would like to see this kind of instrument still existing. Another important instrument is when G7 countries and such bodies like Financial Action Task Force labeling privacy payment or privacy communication technology, basically new technology which provides privacy for citizens globally, as tools for money laundering, for, illicit activities, or financing extremists, or threat to national security. This is a key instrument to undermine afterwards any kind of tools, any kind of security for activists globally, but also in Western jurisdictions. And that is why we also advocate for neutral language for this kind of privacy payment tools. And lastly, but not leastly, Kazakhstan Secret Service agents who filed a criminal complaint against me, and how Belgium justice uncovered the attempt for those agents to weaponize cybersecurity laws, shows the case that not everybody is privileged like me, where I have in Belgium, for example, special protection, but what can face every US citizen and entity when their travel data, communication data, and financial data can be weaponized with no remedy. I think it's one of the most serious threats right now when we have no solutions how to stop these kind of abuses. And this is where I am looking forward to cooperate with you. I'm really grateful for this hearing, because more people aware about these kind of abuses, more we can be protected. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to echo what everyone else said. I'm so grateful, and Freedom House is so grateful for your leadership on this issue. Just reflecting, Freedom House started working on transnational repression. Well, we published our first report in 2021, and in fact, that was a time when transnational repression was really just a subject studied by academics, and our communications team urged us not to use the term transnational repression. They were worried it was too difficult and wouldn't become popular. I think, 5 years later, Freedom House and other organizations who represent people working from exile, human rights defenders, have shown that democracy is not an island, and that you're not necessarily safe just because you've left the territory of a repressive state. And I think that's really important. And so maybe I want to end on a hopeful note. I don't know how often you get a hopeful note here, but there's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of things to be excited about. So the G7 just issued a leader statement on transnational repression. The European Parliament is issuing 2 reports this year on the targeting of human rights defenders in Europe with transnational repression. Chairman, you already mentioned the OHCHR, the brief that they issued, which was in the works for 2 years, but is a really important step forward. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression published a report on exile journalists being targeted by transnational repression. Canada had an inquiry that devoted a lot of attention to transnational repression. The UK Parliamentary Committee for Human Rights is having an inquiry on transnational repression. This is a lot of really important work, and I think even more so, this work has brought together diasporas from many different communities, and that I think is really important for building solidarity. Just some concrete things to end on. I think the executive branch can continue to work through the G7, specifically the rapid response mechanism on transnational repression, which the United States started and which can continue. I would also second the ask to publish the human rights reports by the State Department. They have a section on transnational repression, which is really important to maintain. And then Congress, I think establishing a definition of transnational repression in legislation is very important, and so is directing training for police forces, but also providing direct support to communities and diasporas that are targeted by transnational repression, because ultimately those communities can come up with ways to protect themselves, but they need support in doing that. And so I want to thank you again for organizing this hearing and for the opportunity to testify.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here, I promise I'll end on a hopeful note, but I do want to just point out something that worries me deeply, and that is I fear that the issue of human rights is falling off our priority list, and not just in terms of how we deal with issues like transnational repression, but how we deal with, our foreign policy, our military policy, even our financial policies all around the world. And we need to refocus our leaders on the importance of human rights. I mean, the United States, in my view, should be the country that stands unequivocally and foursquare for human rights, defends people who are being repressed, is there for people, is welcoming to people. And I worry that some of the programs and some of the initiatives that will help us deal with things like transnational repression, to help support people who are being victims, are being cut. And I mean, it has to be more than about words. You have to provide the resources to do the research, to do the reporting, to do the monitoring, to help support individuals who are being targeted. And so all of us need to figure out ways to make sure that our leaders don't walk away from what we know works. As much as I have been critical of the Trump administration, and I will continue to be, because some of the stuff coming out of this administration not only bothers me, but scares me. I think it kind of betrays our values. But I will, on a hopeful note, I have a co-chair, Mr. Smith of New Jersey, who is a Republican, who cares every bit as deeply about human rights as I do, and as I know you do. And we're going to continue to work in a bipartisan way on legislation on transnational repression and on other human rights issues. We have maintained this Human Rights Commission because both of us have felt that a lot of the committees of jurisdiction have not focused enough on human rights. And so we want to make sure that there is one entity here that constantly focuses on this issue. So I'm hopeful we can make some progress. And again, I thank you all for your patience in dealing with all the delays. And I thank you for your testimony, and this hearing is adjourned.